"Please, just make it quick," she begged. And then the mountain man did the unthinkable. A freezing winter night. A battered widow stumbles through the snow, her voice breaking with despair. She begs for mercy at the cabin door. But instead of death, the lonely mountain man pulls her inside and makes a vow that will change everything. By the light of the fire, a shocking secret is revealed, a deed to the town's only spring. A spring powerful enough to save families or destroy them. But word travels fast. Hooves thunder. A posse rises. The sheriff wants her silenced. The preacher hides a guilty past. And the town is ready to burn the mountain man alive for standing. In her defense, now, faith and fire will collide in the high country. He has nothing left to lose. She has everything to fight for. When the town turns against them, will mercy be their downfall or their salvation? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. Lucas. Rourke's weathered hands fed another log into the hungry flames. The fire's warmth barely pushed back against the bitter Colorado winter that howled outside his cabin walls. Fresh snow pressed against the door, piling higher with each passing hour. His muscles ached from splitting wood all afternoon, but he knew every log might mean the difference between life and death in weather like this. The wind screamed through the gaps in the timber walls, making the flames dance and flicker. Lucas pulled his worn wool blanket tighter around his broad shoulders. Even after 15 years in these mountains, nights like this made him feel small against nature's fury. Thump, thump. The sound was so faint, he thought he'd imagined it. Lucas cocked his head, listening hard. There it came again, weak knocking at his door. "Lord Almighty," he muttered, rising slowly. No one in their right mind would be out in this storm. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle before he caught himself. The war had left its mark on him, that hair-trigger wariness that never quite faded. The pounding came again, barely audible above the wind. Lucas crossed the room in 3 long strides and heaved the door open against the drifted snow. A blast of icy air hit him full in the face. A figure stumbled forward, collapsing into his arms like a puppet with cut strings. It was a woman, her dress torn and crusted with ice. Her skin was pale as milk, dark bruises stark against her throat and jaw. She trembled violently, her lips blue with cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and desperate. "Just make it quick." Lucas stiffened. The words hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back to battlefields strewn with dying men begging for mercy. His hands, which had ended so many lives during the war, twitched at his sides. The weight of those memories pressed down on him like lead. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. Past the fear and exhaustion, there was a spark there, a stubborn will to live that contradicted her words. This wasn't truly a death wish. This was terror speaking. Instead of the violence his war-scarred mind first leaped to, Lucas gathered her gently in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, frozen clothes and all. He carried her to the fire, laying her carefully on the bearskin rug before the hearth. "You ain't dying on my floor, ma'am," he said gruffly, piling every blanket he owned around her shaking form. "Not tonight." Lucas moved quickly to the pot that always sat near his fire. The bean soup he'd made that morning would still have some warmth to it. He ladled a portion into his best tin cup, the one without dents. Her trembling began to ease as the fire's heat seeped into her bones. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, gradually steadied. Lucas sat back on his heels, studying her face in the firelight. The bruises told their own story, one he'd seen too often in his life. Someone had hurt this woman, hurt her badly enough to send her fleeing into a killing storm. The wind rattled the cabin shutters, and fresh snow hissed against the windows. Lucas stood and walked to the door, opening it just enough to peer outside. The storm had turned the world white, erasing all trace of tracks or trails. Snow was piling up past his knees already. They weren't going anywhere for a while. He turned back to his unexpected guest, who had curled onto her side near the fire. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was stronger now. The desperate sprint through the storm had clearly exhausted her last reserves. Lucas settled into his chair, positioned where he could watch both the door and his sleeping visitor. The familiar weight of his rifle rested across his knees. If whoever had hurt her came looking, they'd find more than they bargained for. The storm raged on outside, sealing them in with walls of white. Lucas stared into the flames, wondering what twist of providence had sent this wounded stranger to his door. He'd chosen isolation after the war, believing himself beyond redemption. But tonight, fate had forced his hand toward mercy instead of death. He fed another log to the fire and settled in for a long night's vigil. Whatever morning might bring, he'd made his choice. The woman would live, and perhaps in saving her, he might begin to wash away some of the blood that still stained his conscience. The howling wind and crackling flames filled the silence as snow continued to mount outside, trapping them together in his remote cabin until the storm decided to release its grip on the mountain. Morning light crept through the frost-covered windows, casting pale shadows across the cabin floor. Lucas stirred from his chair, his muscles stiff from the night's vigil. The fire had burned low, but the woman still slept beneath his heaviest quilt, her breathing steady and strong. Now, as he added kindling to the embers, she began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, darting around the cabin before settling on him. Fear flickered across her face, then recognition, and finally cautious relief. Water? Lucas offered, holding out a tin cup. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at unseen hurts, and accepted it with trembling hands. "I'm much obliged," she whispered, her voice rough from the cold. "I'm Mariah Gray." She paused, swallowing hard. "Recently widowed." Lucas nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he moved to the cook fire. Lucas Rourke. Beans ain't much of a breakfast, but they're hot. He spooned some into a bowl, adding a chunk of hard bread beside it. Mariah accepted the food gratefully, though her hands shook as she ate. Lucas waited until she'd taken a few bites before speaking again. "Townfolk cast you out?" he asked quietly, noting how she flinched at the question. She set her spoon down, staring into the bowl. They accused me of having Apache blood, called me a disgrace." Her voice cracked. "Said no decent folk would harbor someone like." Lucas's jaw tightened as she unconsciously rubbed her hands. The marks there told their own story. Thin, cruel lines that could only have come from a whip. The kind of wounds that came from trying to protect yourself. "Thank you," Maria said suddenly, meeting his eyes. "For not when I asked you to." She couldn't finish. Lucas looked away, shame burning in his gut. "Almost didn't," he admitted gruffly. "War left some ugly habits." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. The day crept by slowly. Lucas found himself a task that needed doing, patching a draft in the cabin's north wall. The work kept him busy while giving him reason to stay close. Mariah insisted on helping despite her weakness, settling herself at the table to peel potatoes for supper. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if each one cost her something. As evening approached, Lucas lit the oil lamp. Its warm glow softened the cabin's rough edges. Without really thinking about why, he reached for the worn Bible on his shelf, something he hadn't touched since returning from the war. The leather was cracked, pages dog-eared from years of neglect. He opened it randomly, his voice rough as he began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Out of the corner of his eye, He caught Mariah's lips moving silently, along with the familiar words. Something eased in his chest at the sight. When the scripture reading ended, Lucas pulled on his coat. "Need to check the snares," he explained. "Won't be gone long." Mariah nodded, drawing the quilt tighter around her shoulders. As soon as his boots crunched in the snow outside, she reached into the folds of her torn dress with trembling fingers. The paper she withdrew was creased and worn, but she handled it like it was made of gold. Her eyes closed as she clutched it to her chest. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength. The truth in this paper could mean my death, but I can't let them steal what's rightfully mine." Her prayer faded into the cabin's shadows as Lucas's footsteps approached again. He stamped the snow from his boots before stepping inside. The lamp's glow caught Mariah's face as she quickly tucked something away, but Lucas pretended not to notice. He hung his coat by the door, watching as she settled back against the wall. Her face composed once more. The lamplight cast warm shadows around them. Two strangers bound together by circumstance and mercy. Neither fully trusted the other yet, but something had shifted during the day. A fragile beginning of understanding, born in shared scripture and simple kindnesses. Lucas added another log to the fire, and the flames crackled in the companionable silence. Morning brought more snow, thick flakes drifting past the cabin windows like feathers. Lucas stood at the cook fire, demonstrating how to arrange the logs. Just so. Mariah watched intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Stack them like this," he explained, placing a thick log carefully. "Creates a wall that holds the heat." He guided her hands as she tried to copy his movements. The logs clattered, refusing to stay put. Mariah's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry. I know I'm not very good at this." "You're learning," Lucas said simply. "That's what matters." He pulled on his heavy coat. "Need to tend the goats. You keep practicing." In the lean-to, Lucas found his two goats huddled against the bitter wind. As he filled their feed trough, he heard the distinct clatter of falling logs from inside, followed by a frustrated sigh. But soon after came the sound of wood being determinedly restacked. A smile tugged at his mouth. The woman had spirit. He'd give her that dog when he returned. Mariah had managed to bank the fire properly. Her face glowed with quiet pride as she stirred a pot of rabbit stew. They ate in comfortable silence until Mariah set down her spoon, her expression turning serious. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly, "about why they really drove me out." Her hands trembled as she reached into her dress, withdrawing folded paper. "My husband, before he died, and it wasn't natural, no matter what. They claimed he purchased some land." Lucas accepted the worn document she held out. "A deed?" Mariah nodded. Would you read it, please?" Lucas unfolded the paper carefully, squinting at the formal writing. His eyes widened as he read aloud. "This deed grants ownership of the Canyon Spring property, measuring 40 acres, to Matthew Gray and his heirs." He looked up sharply. "The Canyon Spring? That's the only reliable water source for 50 miles. "Yes." Mariah's voice was barely a whisper. "When Matthew died, it passed to me. That's when the accusations started. The Apache blood story. It was just an excuse." Her hands clenched in her lap. "They want the water rights." Lucas studied the deed again, understanding dawning. Control of that spring meant control of the whole valley. No wonder they'd driven her out. A widow alone couldn't defend such a valuable claim. The afternoon light had begun to fade. When they heard it, hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Lucas moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. 3 riders, bundled against the cold, rifles across their saddles. He recognized them from town. "Rourke!" one called out. "We know you're harboring that half-breed widow. Send her out." Lucas's jaw tightened as he reached for his rifle. "Get back from the windows," he murmured to Mariah. She pressed herself against the wall, shaking. "She's a liar and a thief." Another man shouted, "Hand her over and we'll forget about it." Lucas threw the bolt on the door, his voice cold as he called back, "Best ride on. Nothing here concerns you. Don't be a fool, Rourke. That Apache witch has addled your mind." Mariah flinched at the words, but Lucas touched her arm gently. "They'll not take you," he whispered fiercely, while I draw breath. Minutes stretched like hours as the men continued shouting threats. Finally, the leader's voice cut through the growing dark. "This ain't over, Rourke. We'll be back with more men. That spring belongs to the town." The hoofbeats faded slowly into the distance. Lucas kept his rifle ready until the sound disappeared entirely. Only then did he lower the weapon, turning to find Mariah collapsed in his chair, tears streaming silently down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "No one stood up for me since Matthew died." Lucas nodded gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He moved to the woodpile and retrieved his axe, testing its edge with his thumb. Finding it dull, he settled onto a stool and began working the whetstone along the blade with slow, steady strokes. The rhythmic scraping filled the cabin as darkness gathered outside. Mariah watched him work, understanding in her eyes. They both knew this was only the beginning. The men would return, and when they did, they'd come in force. The axe blade gleamed in the firelight as Lucas honed it to a razor's edge, preparing for what they both knew was coming. The next morning brought a bitter chill that seeped through every crack in the cabin walls. Lucas rose before dawn, stirring the banked coals into fresh flame while Mariah wrapped herself tighter in her quilt. "We need to prepare," he said quietly, pouring coffee into tin cups. "They'll come back stronger." Mariah nodded, her face pale, but determined. "Tell me what to do." They worked methodically through the morning hours. Lucas showed her how to wedge wooden blocks between the shutters and window frames, making them harder to force open from outside. Together they stacked firewood inside, enough for several days, while he explained the importance of keeping dry fuel within reach. "Can't fight if we freeze," he muttered, arranging the logs against the wall. Near midday, Lucas retrieved a woolen leather gun belt from his trunk. He pulled out a Colt single-action revolver, checking its cylinder before holding it out to Mariah. Her hands trembled as she took it. "I've never. Time to learn." Lucas's voice was gentle but firm. He showed her how to hold the weapon properly, explaining each part. 6 chambers. Loading gate here. Hammer needs to be at half-cock to load. Mariah's fingers fumbled with the cartridges at first, but Lucas remained patient. Steady now. Like threading a needle, just slower. The comparison helped, and gradually her movements became more confident. "That's it," he encouraged as she successfully loaded all 6 chambers. "Now you can protect yourself if need be." They paused for a simple meal of cornbread and beans. Mariah stared into her cup, lost in thought, before speaking softly. "After Matthew died, I went to Reverend Porter. He'd promised to keep Matthew's papers safe." Her voice turned bitter. "Next day, men came to search our house. The Reverend told them everything." Lucas's jaw tightened, memories of his own betrayal rising unbidden. The taste of coffee turned ashen in his mouth as he remembered trusting officers sending men to die for nothing. He said nothing, but Mariah seemed to understand his silence thawed as evening approached. Lucas noticed Mariah's restless pacing. "Come on," he said, reaching for their coats. "Few minutes of fresh air won't hurt." Outside, the world was transformed. Fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white, muffling all sound. Their breath frosted in the air as they stood on the cabin's small porch. Mariah turned her face to the pale sky, drinking in the peaceful moment. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Hard to believe anyone could harbor such hatred under all this pure white. Lucas grunted in agreement, scanning the tree line out of habit. The landscape looked serene, but he knew better than to trust appearances. They didn't stay out long. The temperature was dropping fast with the sun. After a simple supper, they settled by the fire. The distant howl of wolves echoed through the night, making Mariah draw closer to the hearth's warmth. Lucas pulled out his knife and a piece of pine wood he'd been saving. Without really thinking about it, his hands began shaping a cross. Something he hadn't attempted since before the war. Mariah watched him work, her eyes soft in the firelight. The wooden shavings curled and fell as his blade carefully carved the familiar shape. When the cross began taking form, she spoke quietly. "You're not as lost as you think." Lucas's hand stilled. He stared at the half-finished cross, emotions he couldn't name tightening his throat. After a long moment, Mariah slid from her chair to kneel beside him. "Would you pray with me?" she asked softly. "I've missed having someone to pray with." Lucas hesitated, the weight of years of anger and doubt heavy on his shoulders. But something in her gentle request broke through his defenses. Slowly, he set aside the carving and bowed his head. Mariah's voice was barely above a whisper as she began. "Dear Lord, we thank you for your protection." Her simple, heartfelt words filled the cabin as Lucas listened, his own lips moving silently. To prayers he thought he'd forgotten. The fire crackled softly as they shared this fragile moment of faith. Their shadows merged on the cabin wall behind them. For the first time in years, Lucas felt something like peace settle over him, despite the danger he knew was coming. Days melted together like snowflakes on window panes as winter storms kept Lucas and Mariah confined to the cabin's safety. The howling wind outside made their small shelter feel even more intimate, forcing them to find rhythm in simple daily tasks. One morning, Lucas returned from checking his nearest trapline with a young deer slung across his shoulders. The carcass was already frozen stiff, but it meant fresh meat for their dwindling stores. He showed Mariah how to properly butcher the animal, his knife moving with practiced efficiency. "Waste nothing," he instructed, demonstrating how to separate sinew they could use for sewing. "Even the bones make good soup." Mariah proved an apt student, her hands steady as she helped prepare the meat for smoking. Her sleeves rolled up. She worked without complaint, despite the cold that turned their breath to frost. Lucas found himself watching her more than he meant to, noting how she hummed softly while she worked. Later that afternoon, Mariah discovered one of Lucas's shirts with a tear along the shoulder seam. Without asking, she took up needle and thread. Her stitches neat, and even as she mended the worn fabric, Lucas pretended not to notice how she pressed her face to the shirt once, inhaling its scent before setting to work. "Much obliged," he said gruffly when she handed it back. The repair nearly invisible dot in the evenings. Lucas would take out his mother's old Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. Mariah sat close to share the lamplight as he read from Psalms, his deep voice giving weight to ancient words of comfort and protection. Sometimes she would close her eyes, letting the familiar verses wash over her like a balm. One particularly cold morning, Lucas prepared to check his furthest traps. "Gotta be done," he said, strapping on snowshoes. "Meat won't last forever." Mariah stood in the doorway as he left, her shawl pulled tight. "Be careful," she called softly, watching until he disappeared into the swirling snow. The day stretched. Long as Lucas followed his trapline, the sun was already sinking when he finally turned back toward home, his bag empty of fresh game. As he approached the cabin, something made him pause. There, in the fresh snow, lay tracks that hadn't been there that morning. Boot prints, not animal signs, circling the cabin like hungry wolves. His heart hammering, Lucas burst through the door, rifle ready. "Mara!" She looked up calmly from where she knelt by the fire, adding another log. "I'm fine," she assured him, brushing off her skirts as she stood. They didn't try to come in. Lucas stared at her, his pulse still racing. You saw them? Shadows, moving past the windows. She smiled faintly. I kept the rifle close, just like you showed me. But I reckoned if they meant to break in, they would have done it straight away. Lord above, Lucas breathed, impressed by her steady nerves. He set his rifle down and began removing his snow-covered gear. You did right. Showing fear just encouraged them. That evening, they shared a simple supper of venison stew and the last of the morning's bread. Lucas told a story about his first attempt at trapping when he'd somehow managed to catch nothing but his own boot. Mariah's laugh rang out suddenly, bright and clear as a bell, filling the cabin with unexpected warmth. Lucas felt something shift inside his chest at the sound, like ice breaking up on a spring river. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had laughed in this cabin. The sound seemed to chase away shadows he hadn't even known were their dot, as they worked together to bank the fire for the night. Lucas found himself watching Maria's graceful movements, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her skirts rustled as she moved about the cabin. It all spoke of home in a way he'd nearly forgotten. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine this wasn't temporary, that they were truly family sharing a life together. He pushed the thought away quickly, ashamed of his presumption. Instead, he focused on practical matters, checking that his rifle was loaded before placing it within easy reach of his bedroll. The tracks outside were a stark reminder that danger still lurked, waiting for them to lower their guard. Sleep sound, he told Mariah as she retired to her corner of the cabin. I'm a light sleeper. Nothing'll get past me. She nodded, drawing her quilt close. I know. I trust you, Lucas. Those simple words followed him into his own bedroll, where he lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind and Mariah's steady breathing. His rifle close at hand, dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the morning silence. Lucas stood at the window, rifle ready, while Mariah pressed herself against the wall beside him. Through the frost-edged glass, they watched a lone figure on horseback emerge from the swirling snow. It's Preacher Matthews, Mariah whispered, her face going pale. The man sat tall in his saddle, a black Bible clutched under one arm. His breath steamed in the cold air as he called out, Brother Rourke, I come in peace to speak with you. Lucas's jaw tightened. He glanced at Mariah, noting how she trembled. Your choice, he said softly. Do we let him in? She nodded, though her fingers twisted in her skirts. Maybe he's come to make things right. Lucas opened the door, keeping his rifle visible. Come in, preacher. But mind your manners. The preacher stomped snow from his boots and stepped inside. He was a well-fed man with silver at his temples, wearing a coat too fine for frontier life. His smile seemed genuine as he nodded to Mariah. Sister Gray, it does my heart good to see you safe. Lucas gestured to a chair by the fire. State your business. Matthew settled himself, holding his hands out to the warmth. Terrible cold we're having. The Lord tests us sorely some days. His eyes darted around the cabin, lingering on the wooden chest where Lucas had stored Mariah's deed. You didn't ride through this weather to discuss the cold, Lucas said. The preacher's smile faded. He looked between them, then spoke in hushed tones. Brother Rourke, might we speak privately? Anything you need to say it here. Matthew sighed heavily. Very well. He turned to Mariah. Child, I've come about your husband's spring. His fingers worried at the Bible's leather cover. There's something I must confess. Mariah's hands gripped the back of a chair. What? Confession? Years ago, when Thomas first bought that land, there were documents. Proof of his ownership that I was asked to keep safe. The preacher's voice dropped lower. powerful men in town made it clear what would happen if those papers ever came to light. I buried them in my garden and told Thomas they were lost. Lucas's knuckles went white on his rifle stock. You betrayed them. I was weak, Matthews admitted. The shame of it haunts me still. He stood, reaching toward Mariah. That's why I'm here now. Sister, for your own safety, you must give up this claim. These men, they won't stop until they have that spring. Get out. Lucas's voice was deadly quiet. Brother Rourke, be reasonable. I said get out. Lucas stepped forward, rifle raised. Before I forget, you're a man of God. The preacher backed toward the door, his hands raised. I'll pray for you both. He paused with his hand on a latch. Sister Gray, think on what I said. Some fights aren't worth dying for. After Matthews rode away, Mariah sank into a chair, her face ashen. I trusted him, she whispered. When Thomas died, I went to him first. He said he'd help me. Lucas couldn't bear to watch her pain. Rage boiled in his chest, familiar as war drums. Without a word, he grabbed his axe and stormed. Outside, the crack of splitting wood echoed across the snow as he threw himself into the task, trying to drive out the memory of the preacher's false piety with each swing. He chopped until his hands were raw and blistering, until sweat froze on his face, despite the bitter cold. Only when the light began to fade did he finally stop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, Mariah waited with clean cloth and the jar of healing salve she'd made from pine sap. She took his hands in hers without a word, carefully cleaning and wrapping each palm. Her touch was gentle, but Lucas could feel the strength in her fingers. You didn't have to defend me, she said softly. Yes, I did. She secured the last bandage, but didn't release his hands. When I collapsed at your door that night, I thought I was dying. But something led me here, through all that snow. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I believe it was Providence. Lucas stared into the fire, unable to meet her eyes. The rage still simmered beneath his skin, but now it mixed with something else, a longing he'd thought died in him years ago. His hands tingled where she touched them, and for once, he didn't pull away. The flames crackled in the silence between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines like a prayer for mercy, for redemption, for all the things Lucas had stopped believing in until now. The morning. Dawn crisp and clear, the storm finally spent. Sunlight sparkled across untouched snow, and a brilliant blue sky stretched overhead. Lucas stood at the cabin door, breathing in the sharp winter air. After days of confinement, the open wilderness called to him. Might be good to check my supply cache, he said, glancing at Mariah. Could use the flour and salt stored there. Would you care to join me? Maria's eyes lit up. Yes, please. These walls feel mighty close after so long. Lucas hitched up his wooden sled, laying fresh pine boughs across the slats for comfort. He helped Mariah settle onto the makeshift seat, tucking a wool blanket around her legs. The sled creaked as they set out, runners cutting clean tracks through pristine snow. The journey was slow but peaceful. Pine branches hung heavy with white, and their breath frosted in the air. Mariah tilted her face to the sun, color returning to her cheeks. I forgot how beautiful it could be up here, she said softly. They passed a frozen creek, ice gleaming, like polished glass. Lucas guided the sled carefully across, testing each step. Used to be a mining camp near here, he said, breaking his usual silence. Back before the war changed everything. Mariah turned to study his face. You fought in the war? Lucas nodded, his eyes distant. Union sighed, saw things no man should see. Did things? He fell quiet, jaw working. After, I couldn't face people anymore. Shame drives a man to strange places. Is that why you live alone up here? Reckon so. Lucas adjusted the sled rope across his chest. Figure I owe a debt I can't never repay. Least up here I ain't hurting nobody else. They reached a narrow ravine where an old mine shaft gaped black against gray stone. Lucas secured the sled and led Mariah to a cleverly hidden entrance nearby. Inside, shelves held carefully preserved supplies, flour sealed in tin, salt blocks wrapped in oilcloth, boxes of rifle cartridges. Your own private store, Maria marveled, helping him load the sled. A man learns to prepare, Lucas said. Winter's long up here. As they worked, Mariah hummed softly, an old hymn that echoed gently off the stone walls. Lucas found himself pausing to listen, something tight in his chest, easing at the simple melody. The sun had passed its peak when they finished. Lucas secured the cache entrance and helped Mariah back onto the sled. They were halfway home when he spotted movement on a distant ridge. 3 riders silhouetted against the bright sky, watching. Town folk, he muttered, quickening his pace. Been tracking us. Mariah's hands clutched the sled rails, but her voice stayed steady. They mean to wear us down. Won't let them, Lucas promised, though his heart felt heavy as iron. They made it back to the cabin without incident. Lucas immediately set to work reinforcing the door, adding another plank across the middle. Mariah unpacked their supplies, moving with quiet efficiency in the gathering dusk dot as evening settled in. She stirred a pot of rabbit stew hanging over the fire. Steam rose fragrant with herbs she'd found dried in Lucas's stores. Without seeming to notice, she began to sing, an old ballad about home and hearth, her voice clear and sweet in the firelit quiet. Lucas sat in his chair, whittling a new peg for the door latch. The familiar motion of knife on wood slowed as he listened. The song spoke of peace, of welcome fires burning bright against the dark. He couldn't remember the last time music had filled these walls. Mariah glanced up, catching his eye. A smile touched her lips, and suddenly Lucas found himself chuckling, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. She laughed too, surprise and delight mixing in the sound. For just a moment, the cabin felt different. Warmer somehow, despite the winter pressing close outside. Lucas watched Mariah stir the stew, her movements sure and graceful in the firelight. The peace he'd sought alone in these mountains somehow felt closer now than it ever had before. But as she ladled stew into their bowls, his gaze drifted to the reinforced door. Those riders on the ridge meant trouble was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. Lucas accepted his bowl with quiet thanks, the weight of responsibility settling back across his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. The days stretched gentle and quiet after their supply run. Lucas found himself settling into a rhythm unlike his usual solitary routine. Each morning, wood shavings curled at his feet as he carved a sturdy new bench from pine logs. His skilled hands shaped the wood with care, smoothing rough edges into welcoming curves. Across the cabin, Mariah gathered scraps of yarn she'd found in an old chest. Her nimble fingers worked the worn threads into something new, a simple scarf growing longer each day. The soft click of her knitting needles joined the rasp of his carving knife in comfortable harmony. "Found these behind your winter stores," she said one morning, holding up the colorful threads. "Seems a shame to let them go to waste." Lucas nodded, remembering the chest's origin. Trading party left those behind years ago. Never had use for them myself. Well, they'll keep someone warm now. Her eyes crinkled with amusement. Though perhaps not as warm as those biscuits I nearly burned yesterday. Lucas couldn't help but chuckle at the memory, both of them coughing through the smoke as Mariah rescued the blackened lumps from his cast iron stove. Reckoned they'd have made fine doorstops at least. Her laughter joined his, bright and clear. These moments came easier now. the weight of danger temporarily lifted by shared smiles and quiet understanding. Even their evening prayers felt different, less like lonely words cast into silence, more like true communion. One night, as snow fell soft outside, Lucas found himself speaking of things long buried. "Used to dream of having a family here," he admitted, staring into the fire. "Before the war, thought I'd build a proper house, maybe raise some cattle." His voice roughened. "But after what I saw, what I did, figured those dreams died with everything else." Mariah set aside her knitting, regarding him thoughtfully. "Perhaps the dream isn't dead," she said softly. "Perhaps it was waiting." Her words settled deep in Lucas's chest, stirring something he'd thought forever lost. The firelight caught her face, gentle and understanding, and for the first time in years, he let himself imagine a different future. One where this cabin might truly become a home, where loneliness gave way to belonging. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling low. Lucas added another log, watching sparks dance upward. The peace of the moment felt almost tangible. A warm blanket wrapped around them. Both then torchlight flickered through the shutters. Lucas moved fast, extinguishing their lamp with one quick breath. Through the sudden darkness, he heard multiple horses outside, their riders moving with deadly purpose. "Lucas Rourke." A familiar voice rang out. Sheriff Maddox, his tone hard as iron. "We know you're harboring the Gray Woman. Bring her out, and we'll settle this peaceful-like." Lucas's hand found his rifle even as he passed Mariah the loaded revolver. She took it without trembling, her face set with quiet determination in the dying firelight. "Got no business here, Sheriff," Lucas called back, positioning himself by the reinforced door. "Best ride on home." "Can't do that, Rourke. That woman's got something belongs to the town. We mean to collect." Bootsteps crunched in the snow, circling the cabin. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Lucas caught Mariah's eye across the room. She had pressed herself against the wall beside the window, revolver held steady. The trust in her gaze steadied his racing heart. "Last chance, Rourke," Maddox shouted. "Surrender now, or..." A new sound cut through the night, the crack of splitting wood, followed by hungry flames. Orange light blazed sudden and bright through the window. Lucas's stomach dropped as he smelled smoke. "They've fired the barn," he whispered, watching thin tendrils of gray seep under the door. The dry wood of his little barn would burn fast. And if the wind shifted, Maria's voice came quiet but firm in the darkness. "We won't let them drive us out." Her fingers tightened on the revolver's grip. "This is our home now, our home." The words echoed in Lucas's chest as he gripped his rifle tighter, smoke curling around their feet like ghostly snakes. Everything they built over these peaceful days, the laughter, the prayers, the cautious dreams of future joy, now hung balanced on the edge of violence. Outside, the barn blazed higher, casting wild shadows through the windows. Sheriff Maddox's men called to each other, their voices muffled by the growing roar of flames. And still the smoke crept in, thickening with each passing moment, while Lucas and Mariah stood their ground in the darkness of their besieged home. The barn's flames painted the night sky orange, casting wild shadows across the snow. Lucas watched in horror as burning debris lifted on the hot wind, drifting toward the cabin's cedar-shake roof. Each ember threatened to ignite their shelter. "Half. To get up there," he muttered, grabbing a bucket. "Or we'll lose everything." Maria grabbed his arm. "They'll shoot you the moment you step outside." "No choice." Lucas squeezed her hand. "Keep low, away from the windows." He burst through the door, snow crunching under his boots as he raced to the water barrel. The first shot cracked past his head, splintering the doorframe. Lucas dove behind, a stack of firewood, heart pounding. "That was a warning, Rourke." Sheriff Maddox called from the darkness. "Next one won't miss." Lucas hefted the filled bucket, muscles straining. More shots rang out as he scrambled up the ladder propped against the cabin wall. Icy water sloshed down his front as bullets whined. Past. He doused the first sparks he saw catching in the dry wood, then dropped flat against the sloped roof as gunfire intensified. Inside, Mariah's coughing echoed through the rafters. Smoke from the barn fire was seeping through every crack, filling the cabin with a gray haze. Lucas slid down and darted back inside, finding her doubled over near the hearth. "Surrender the woman and the deed," Maddox shouted, "or we'll burn you both out." Lucas fired 2 warning shots through the window. "Back off, Sheriff. You've no right." But the smoke was getting worse. Mariah's coughs grew more violent, her face pale in the firelight. Lucas watched her struggle for breath, his mind racing. They couldn't hold out much longer. The smoke would kill her before the flames reached them. He checked his ammunition, then knelt beside her. "Listen close," he whispered. "I've got a plan, but you won't like it." "No," she rasped, seeing the look in his eyes. "Don't you dare. I'll draw their fire," he continued. "Create enough chaos for you to slip out the back with the deed. Head up the mountain trail. There's a cave marked with 3 notches. You'll be safe there." Tears streaked her smoke-stained cheeks. "They'll kill you." "Maybe." Lucas managed a grim smile. "But they won't get that deed, or you." Hours crept by as they waited for false dawn, when darkness would begin to lift, but shadows would still offer cover. The barn collapsed in on itself with a thunderous crash, sending a fresh wave of sparks into the sky. The posse kept their distance, waiting them out. Just before dawn, Lucas turned to Mariah. His calloused hand trembled slightly as he lifted hers to his lips, a gesture so gentle, so foreign to his rough nature, that her breath caught. He pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Ready?" He whispered. She nodded, unable to speak. The deed was secure inside her dress, close to her heart. Lucas checked his rifle one last time. "Wait for my signal, then run. Don't look back." He slipped out into the gray pre-dawn, rifle raised. "Maddox," he bellowed, "let's talk terms." Gunfire erupted immediately. Lucas dove behind an overturned water trough, returning shots. He worked his way steadily away from the cabin, drawing their attention. Through the shutters, Mariah watched in horror as the posse closed in on him. 2 men tackled Lucas from behind. While he reloaded, his rifle went flying as they drove him face first into the snow. More men piled on, fists and boots striking hard. Lucas fought like a cornered wolf, but there were too many. Sheriff Maddox approached, twirling his pistol. "Enough! Bind him!" They yanked Lucas up, blood streaming from his nose and split lip. Rope bit into his wrists as they tied them tight behind his back. Through swollen eyes, he glanced at the cabin's back wall, praying Maria had made it out. "Mount." "Up," Maddox ordered. "We'll let him cool his heels in jail while we decide what to do with him." They dragged Lucas to a horse, forcing him into the saddle. The posse formed up around him, their victory evident in their jeers and laughter. As they rode down the mountain trail, the rising sun painted the sky blood red. Inside the now empty cabin, Mariah emerged from her hiding place behind the stone chimney. She had watched it all, forcing herself to stay silent as they beat him. Now she stood alone in the morning light, watching the barn's last embers die in the snow. Her legs gave out. She sank to her knees, the deed crinkling against her chest. Tears fell freely as she clasped her hands in desperate prayer. "Lord in heaven," she whispered, "protect him. Please, protect him." The rising sun cast long shadows through the cabin's open door, touching the spot where Lucas had kissed her hand. Outside, smoke rose in thin ribbons from the barn's blackened ruins, carrying her prayers skyward. Lucas groaned as consciousness returned. Cold stone pressed against his back, and iron manacles bit into his wrists. The town jail's familiar musty smell filled his nostrils. Through swollen eyes, he made out the metal bars of his cell. Morning light filtering through a tiny window. Sheriff Maddox's boots clicked on the wooden floor as he approached. Well, the mountain man finally wakes. Lucas said nothing, testing the chains that secured him to the wall. They held firm. All this trouble, Maddox continued, for a worthless half-breed widow. He spat the words like poison. Where's your pride, Rourke? War hero like you, defending someone like her? The words stirred something fierce in Lucas's chest. She's worth 10 of you, Maddox. The sheriff's face darkened. He gripped the cell bars. That spring belongs to the town. Always has. Your precious widow will learn that soon enough, assuming she hasn't frozen to death in those mountains. Outside the jail, voices and footsteps grew louder. Lucas could hear excitement in the crowd gathering in the town square. A man's voice called out about the upcoming water deed auction, drawing cheers. Hear that? Maddox smiled. Folks are mighty, eager to set things right. Once that deed's properly sold, order returns to our fine town. High in the mountains, Mariah huddled in the cave Lucas had told her about. The deed lay heavy against her chest, reminding her of all that had been lost. She could flee north, perhaps find sanctuary in another territory. The thought tempted her, but Lucas's face filled her mind. He had sacrificed everything to protect her. She could not abandon him. Lord, give me strength, she whispered, pulling her cloak tighter. The decision crystallized in her heart like frost on a window pane. She would not run. Carefully, she picked her way down the mountain trail as afternoon shadows lengthened. Her feet remembered the path from when townsfolk had driven her out weeks ago. This time, determination steadied each step. Dusk painted the sky purple when Mariah slipped into town. She kept her hood drawn low, moving like a shadow between buildings. The church stood dark and silent, its weathered doors unlocked. Inside, the familiar smell of candle wax and old wood wrapped around her like a blanket. Mariah made her way to the altar, dropping to her knees. The quiet darkness held her like a mother's embrace as she prayed. Lord, I am afraid, she admitted softly, but I will not hide any longer. Give me the courage to face them, to speak truth to those who deal in lies. Voices outside drew her attention. Two men passed near the church window, their words carrying clearly in the evening air. Auction's tomorrow at noon, one said. But if that deed ain't produced, sheriff says we take it by force. Search every building if we have to. Good, the other replied. About time someone put things right. Can't have outsiders controlling our water. Mariah's hands trembled, but not from fear. Righteous anger filled her chest. These men would steal what was legally hers, twist the law to serve their greed. She thought of Lucas, beaten and jailed for defending justice. Her resolve hardened like steel in a forge. I will not cower, she whispered fiercely. This is my land, my husband's legacy. I will stand before them all. The church bell began to toll, marking the evening hour. Its deep notes echoed through the town, reaching Lucas in his cell. He lifted his head, wondering if Mariah was safe in the mountain cave. Had his sacrifice been enough, or had he failed her completely? The bell's final toll faded into silence. Lucas bowed his head, chains clinking softly. Lord, he prayed, words rough from disuse, protect her. Give her wisdom to choose right. In the church, Mariah rose from her knees. Through the window, she could see lanterns being lit in the square, preparations already beginning for tomorrow's auction. Instead of dread, she felt calm purpose fill her heart. She would face them openly, stand before them all with truth as her shield. The sun's last light faded from the church's stained glass windows, leaving Mariah in darkness. But her path ahead was clear. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but tonight, she would prepare her spirit for the battle to come. Dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold as townspeople filed into the weathered wooden church. The usual quiet of Sunday morning gave way to excited chatter. Men in their best coats and women in pressed skirts filled the pews, though few carried prayer books. Most clutched hastily written bidding notes for the auction to follow. Sheriff Maddox stood near the front, his badge catching the light streaming through stained glass windows. He conferred in low tones with several wealthy ranchers, their heads bent together like conspirators. The preacher adjusted his collar nervously at the pulpit, sweat beading on his brow despite the morning chill. His trembling hands shuffled papers that weren't his usual sermon notes as the bell tolled 9. The church doors swung open. Mariah Gray stood in the doorway, backlit by morning sun. She wore a clean, simple dress, her dark hair neatly pinned back. The deed she protected so fiercely was clasped in her steady hands. Silence fell like a heavy blanket as she stepped forward. Her boots clicked against worn floorboards as she walked straight down the center aisle, head held high. Women drew back their skirts as she passed. Men turned away or stared openly. Gasps rippled through the congregation. "The nerve!" someone hissed. "How dare she show her face here?" Mariah reached the front of the church. Without hesitation, she turned to face the crowd and held the deed above her head, the paper catching sunlight through the windows. "This land," she declared, her clear voice carrying to every corner, "was purchased legally by my husband, Thomas Gray. The spring and surrounding acres are rightfully mine." Sheriff Maddox's face darkened with rage. "Arrest her," he barked, stepping forward. "She has no place among decent folk." But Maria stood her ground. She unfolded the deed with careful movements and began to read aloud. "This document hereby transfers ownership of the canyon spring and surrounding 50 acres to Thomas Gray, his heirs and assigns." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "Signed and witnessed this 15th day of May, 1877. The preacher gripped his pulpit, face ashen. Sweat trickled down his temples as Mariah's steady gaze found him. "You knew the truth," she said softly. "You witnessed my husband's signature that day." A heavy silence filled the church. The preacher's shoulders slumped, guilt etching deep lines in his face. He looked out at his congregation, then down at his trembling hands. "God forgive me," he whispered, then straightened. "She speaks truth. I witnessed Thomas Gray's purchase. Later, when pressure came to hide it, I concealed evidence of the sale." His voice cracked. "I have carried that shame before God ever since." Murmurs rose from the pews. Some faces showed shock, others growing sympathy. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs in his jail cell. Lucas pressed against the bars, straining to hear the commotion from the church. The walls muffled most words, but he caught the rise and fall of Mariah's voice. His chains clinked as he bowed his head. "Keep her safe, Lord," he prayed, voice rough with emotion. "Give her strength to stand." Back in the church, Sheriff Maddox's face had turned purple with fury. "This changes nothing," he shouted. "That deed's worthless without proper registration." "Caesar!" Several men rose uncertainly from their pews, but others remained seated, looking troubled. A woman's voice called out, "Let her speak." "The spring belongs to all of us," another added. Mariah's voice cut through the growing chaos. "I claim what is legally mine," she declared, "not out of greed, but justice. My husband died believing in the law's protection. Will you prove him wrong?" The sheriff signaled to his deputies, "Take her." And that deed, men moved forward, reaching for Mariah. But something had shifted in the crowd. Where before they'd seen an outcast, Now they witnessed a widow standing for truth. Sympathy stirred in hearts long hardened by prejudice. More voices joined the chorus of protest. "This ain't right. Let the law decide proper." "But the sheriffs—" Men pressed forward, hands outstretched to grab Mariah. She clutched the deed to her chest, chin lifted proudly though fear flickered in her eyes. The precious paper that had cost her husband's life, that had driven her through winter storms to Lucas's cabin, that had sparked this fight for justice. She would not surrender it easily. Around her, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, a tide of changing sentiment rising against the sheriff's raw display of power. Yet Maddox's deputies continued their advance, boxing Mariah in against the altar rail as morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass above, painting the scene in shards of colored light dotting the dank jail cell. Lucas pulled against his chains until the iron bit into his wrists. Through the barred window, Maria's voice carried on the morning breeze, strong and clear despite its distance. His heart swelled with pride, even as worry gnawed at him. He knew Sheriff Maddox wouldn't let her leave that church freely. Deputy Frank Latham paced nearby, rifle held loosely in uncertain hands. The young man's eyes kept darting to the church, then back to Lucas, conflict plain on his face. "Ain't right," the deputy muttered, more to himself than his prisoner. "Sheriff said she was dangerous, but she's just standing up for what's hers." Lucas saw his chance. "Then do what's right, son. You know this isn't justice." The deputy's grip tightened on his rifle, then loosened. I need some coffee." He turned away, steps hurried. The moment the deputy disappeared around the corner, Lucas threw his weight against the chains. Muscles straining, he braced one foot against the wall. The rusted lock holding his chains groaned under the pressure. Lucas thought of Mariah standing alone before the town's judgment, and strength surged through him. With a final heave, the ancient lock snapped. He wasted no time. Grabbing his confiscated rifle from the deputy's desk, Lucas burst out of the jail. His boots pounded across the muddy street toward the white-painted church. Inside, he heard shouts. Rising, Lucas shouldered through the heavy wooden doors, just as two of Maddox's men seized Mariah's arms. She struggled against their grip, still clutching the deed to her chest. The sheriff stood nearby, satisfaction twisted across his face. "Let her go." Lucas's voice boomed through the sanctuary. Every head turned. Women gasped. Men reached for weapons, but Lucas didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he strode down the aisle, his eyes locked on Mariah's face. "You all know me," he declared, voice carrying to the rafters. "I fought in the war, killed men, lived alone with that guilt. But what's happening here today is a different kind of killing. Killing of justice, killing of mercy." He reached the front of the church, standing tall despite his battered appearance. "That spring water you're all so eager to control? It's God's gift to this land, meant to sustain families, grow crops, water stock, not to make a few men rich while others thirst." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Lucas saw uncertainty replace hardness in many eyes. "I've lived in these mountains 15 years, he continued. "Seen drought kill cattle, seen children sick from bad water. That spring could help everyone if we share it right." He gestured to Mariah. This good woman and her husband understood that. They bought that land legal, planning to let all draw from it fair. The sheriff's face darkened. "Shoot him," he ordered his men, but no one moved. "You gonna gun down?" "Veteran in God's house," someone called from the pews. "Let the man speak." Lucas stepped closer to Mariah. The men holding her arms loosened their grip, looking uncertain. "I've done wrong in my life," Lucas admitted. "Lived alone thinking I deserved no better. But when this brave woman collapsed at my door half dead from your cruelty, I learned something. About mercy, about justice, about what's worth fighting for. More voices joined the chorus of protest. He's right. The spring should serve all. Let her keep the deed. The sheriff's face purpled. This is rebellion. I'll have you all arrested. But his words fell flat as townsfolk rose from their pews. The tide had turned. Where before they'd seen an outcast widow and a mountain hermit, now they witnessed neighbors standing for what was right. Put it to a vote, someone shouted. Let the town decide. The deed is legal, another added. Preacher Dunn admitted it. That men gripping Mariah's arms released her entirely. She stumbled forward, and Lucas caught her elbow, steadying her. Their eyes met briefly, strength flowing between them. Sheriff Maddox looked around wildly as his authority crumbled. More townspeople stood, voices rising in support of Mariah's claim. Even his own deputies stepped back, unwilling to oppose the surging crowd. This ain't over, the sheriff snarled, but his voice quavered. He backed toward the door as the congregation pressed forward, their combined will like a wave washing away his power. Lucas kept his hand on Mariah's arm, marveling at how God's justice could flow as surely as spring water, wearing down the hardest stone. Around them, the townspeople's shouts for fairness filled the church like a hymn of redemption. Redemption. I've watched my cattle die. The shout rang through the church as Jeremiah Cooper, a weathered rancher, rose from his pew. His calloused hands gripped the wooden bench in front of him. 3 summers now, we've paid dear for every drop of water. My youngest girl took fever last August because we couldn't spare enough clean water for drinking. Heads nodded throughout the congregation. The sheriff's confident sneer faltered as more voices joined the chorus. Cooper's right. Martha Wilson stood, her Sunday bonnet quivering with emotion. We're all God's children here. That spring water should help everyone, not just them that can pay the sheriff's prices. Sheriff Maddox's hand twitched toward his gun, but the sight of so many townspeople rising stopped him. His deputies exchanged uncertain glances, stepping away from Maria. This is nonsense, Maddox blustered, but his voice had lost its authority. You're listening to a half-breed and a mountain hermit over your own sheriff? We're listening too. The truth, Cooper shot back. His wife touched his arm, tears in her eyes. My family suffered enough. Mariah Gray has legal right to that spring, and she's offering to share it fair. That's more Christian charity than we've seen from you, Sheriff. The preacher, who had been silent until now, stumbled forward. His hands trembled as he fell to his knees before Mariah. Forgive me, he sobbed, his shoulders shaking. I hid the truth about your husband's deed. The sheriff threatened my congregation if I didn't comply. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'll record it proper at the county office. Before God is my witness, I'll make it right. Maria reached down, helping the old man to his feet. There's grace enough for all of us, she said softly. Lucas, drained from his escape and confrontation, sank heavily onto a nearby pew. The weeks of tension, the night in the jail, and the morning struggle had taken their toll. Maria was at his side in an instant, her cool hand checking the bruises on his face. You need rest, she whispered, kneeling beside him. The sheriff looked around the church, seeing his support crumbling. Even his most loyal men were backing away, unwilling to stand against their neighbor's united front. This isn't over, he growled, but the threat in his voice rang hollow. Yes, it is, Cooper declared. We'll take this to the territorial judge if need be. Old Town will testify about your bullying ways. Maddox's face reddened. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the church, leaving his badge on the floor behind him. A collective breath of relief swept through the congregation. Women began to cry and embrace. Men shook hands, years of water feuds dissolving in the morning light streaming through the church windows. The townsfolk gathered around Lucas and Mariah, seeing them with new eyes. where before they'd witnessed a dangerous recluse and an outcast. Widow. Now they recognized the courage and honor that had brought justice to their community. As the sun began to set that evening, the church bell rang out across the valley. Its clear tone spoke not of conflict, but of peace, of wrongs made right, of mercy triumphing over greed. The sound echoed off the mountains where Lucas's cabin stood waiting, no longer a place of lonely exile, but a symbol of refuge and redemption. Lucas and Mariah walked out of the church hand in hand. The deed was secure in her pocket, but more precious was the knowledge that they had found not just justice, but belonging. Townspeople nodded respectfully as they passed, children waved, and even the most hardened ranchers tipped their hats. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, a divine reminder that even the darkest nights could give way to beautiful beginnings. As they walked together down the church steps, their joined hands spoke of a future neither had dared to imagine before. Providence had brought them together in that snowbound cabin. A week after the confrontation at the church, winter's grip still held firm on the Colorado mountains. Inside Lucas Rourke's barn, newly rebuilt with the town's help, warmth and hope glowed bright against the gathering dusk. Fresh-cut timber formed sturdy walls, the scent of pine still sharp in the air. Where charred ruins had stood, clean planks now rose, a testament to healing and new beginnings. Lucas paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of his neighbor's handiwork. Men who'd once shunned him had spent days hauling logs through snow, raising beams and nailing boards. Even Cooper had brought his sons to help, sharing stories and coffee during breaks. The barn stood stronger now than before, much like the bonds forged in its rebuilding. Inside the cabin, Mariah moved gracefully between stove and table, setting out 2 bowls of steaming stew. The aroma of sage and beef filled the warm air. Lucas hung his coat by the door, snow melting from his boots onto the worn floorboards. "Smells like heaven," he said softly, settling into his chair. Mariah smiled, her eyes bright in the lamplight. "It's amazing what a few extra spices from Mrs. Wilson's garden can do." She broke apart a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from trading at the general store. "I never thought I'd see the day when folks would welcome me at their doors." Lucas reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. Providence has a way of turning things around. After supper, Lucas retrieved the half-carved wooden cross he'd set aside weeks ago. His knife moved steadily now, each cut sure and purposeful. Shavings curled at his feet as the cross took shape, smooth and strong. When finished, he stood and placed it carefully on the stone mantel. Mariah watched him, then walked to the shelf where she kept her own lamp. She lit it with steady hands, its glow joining the first lamp's light. The cabin seemed to expand with warmth, shadows retreating to distant corners. "This isn't a place of exile anymore," she declared, her voice full of quiet joy. "It's a home." Lucas nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Together, they moved to the cabin door, opening it to gaze out at the wilderness. Snow fell in lazy spirals, each flake catching lamplight from the windows. The mountain peaks stood dark against the night sky, familiar sentinels over their small valley. They stood side by side, shoulders touching, watching nature's quiet dance. No longer outcasts, no longer alone. Their faith had led them through darkness to light, their love forged in winter's trial. Behind them, 2 lamps burned bright, a beacon of hope and redemption against the vast Colorado night. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.